For this next video lecture, so we will continue the topics under the audit documentation. So this time we will be discussing about the different types of working papers. Okay, so the first type of a working paper is what we call audit administrative working papers. So these working papers are designed to aid the auditors in planning and administration of the engagement. So an example of this is our audit program. Okay, so this is the type of audit administrative working papers that is used by the auditor. So the next type of working paper is working trial balance. Okay, what is a working trial balance? This is a listing of accounts in the client's general ledger with columns that include adjusted or unadjusted amounts directly from the client's accounting records, proposed adjusting entries, and adjusted or audited amounts. Meaning, in this case, the auditor will prepare a working trial balance for audit purposes. First, he will have the columns for the items that is from the financial statements of the entity presented, and then based on the audit result of the substantive procedures, he may have some adjustments or proposed adjustment columns. And then after effecting the suggested adjustments, the auditor will have the column for the adjusted or what we call audited amounts or corrected amounts. But then again, this should be reflected, and the FS of the entity, which is a subject for correction, should be corrected, and those adjustments will be reflected by the management, meaning they will prepare another financial statements which are now corrected, okay, based on this working trial balance by the auditor. Another type of working paper is lead schedules. So these are the schedules that summarize similar accounts, the total of which is typically transferred to the working trial balance. Normally, this is part of the adjustments and based on the substantive procedures made by the auditor. So this is where the auditor will document such items or related evidences. Another type of working paper is supporting schedules. So these are the detailed schedules prepared by the auditor in support of specific amounts on the FS. So meaning these are the result again of the substantive procedures. For example, the auditor has recalculated a particular account balance. So this is where that recalculation is usually placed, or this is the content of our supporting schedules. Okay, and lastly is the summary of adjusting and reclassifying entries. So adjusting entries are corrections of material errors in the accounting records of the entity that is discovered by the auditor. While our reclassifying entries, these are made in the statements to present accounting information properly even when the general balances are correct. Meaning, the balances are correct, but the classification of accounts may seem to have some deviations or differences. So the auditor just reclassify these accounts, but the total amount are still the same. Okay, so those are the different types of working papers. So the next topic is about classification of our working papers. So in this case, our working paper or audit working paper may be grouped by the auditor according to the following. So first, we have what we call current file. So this file contains the information which are relevant to the audit of a particular year. That's why it's called as current file. Again, this relates to the current year's examination only. So this may include a copy of the FS, working trial balance, lead schedules, and the audit program. The next type of or classification of working paper is permanent file. So this file contains the information of continuing significance to the auditor when performing recurring and the current audits of the client. Meaning, in this case, if the auditor is still uh, the auditor for the current period, he was also the predecessor and the successor auditor. So this will include copies of the articles of incorporation and bylaws, bond and other long-term contracts, analysis of non-current accounts, organizational chart, documentation of understanding of the entity, and their system of internal control. So these are the items that should be included in the permanent file. Okay, next is correspondence or administrative file. So this file contains all the letters or communication or correspondence to, from, or on behalf of a client, and is especially useful for planning the audit. Okay, and lastly is the tax file. So this file contains information which are relevant to a client's past, current, and even future income and property tax obligations. And this will also serve as a basis for preparing the current year returns or for performing other tax services by the same audit or firm for the entity. Okay, so those are the different types of working or audit working paper. Okay, so the next topic is the ownership and confidentiality of working papers. So, unless otherwise specified by law or regulation, the working papers are the property of the auditor or the firm where the auditor is employed or is related to. However, the firm may, at its discretion, will make portions of the audit documentation available to the clients, provided such disclosure does not undermine the validity of the work performed, or in the case of assurance engagements, the independence of the firm and its personnel. So again, depending on the rules and regulations that is governed, okay, under these types of working papers. And lastly, while the working papers are the property of the auditor, he may not show it to any third parties or in public unless there is consent on the part of the client to disclose this information. There is a professional right or duty to the auditor to disclose this documentation, and disclosure is required by law, or the court has requested the auditor to present this working paper as part of the evidence in a court proceedings. Okay. So those are for the confidentiality and ownership of working papers. Okay, and then we also have retention of working paper. So how long does working paper should be retained by the auditor? So the need of the firm for retention of engagement documentation and the period of such retention will vary. And this will depend on the nature of if the engagement and the firm's circumstances as well. So for example, whether the engagement documentation is needed to provide a record of matters for continuing significance to future engagements with the same client. Okay, so this will determine also how long do they need to retain such documentation or working paper. The working paper should also be kept for a period of time which is considered to be sufficient to meet the needs of the auditor's practice. Okay, so he may refer this documentation for his next audit engagement with other clients, but this is just a reference. Okay, and he will not use the same working papers for other clients. Of course, he has to gather evidence, okay, from them. And the retention period for audit engagements, this is ordinarily no shorter than 5 years. So minimum of 5 years from the date of the auditor's report, unless a longer retention period is mandated by the legal or any regulatory requirements. So the safest, I guess, is 10 years. Okay. Okay, so that is how long working paper should be retained by the auditor or the firm. Okay, and lastly is audit file. Okay, so an audit file, so this represents one or more folders to other storage media. It may be physical or in electronic form. So this contains the records that comprise the audit documentation for a specific uh, engagement. Okay, and firms are required to adopt the policies and procedures for the timely completion of the assembly of these audit files. So the assembly of audit files should ordinarily be completed not more than 60 days after the date of the auditor's report. So meaning audit file is just the compilation of all the documents, the audit documentation, auditor's report, and all other data or information related to a specific audit engagement. Okay, so this is again used for uh, future practice and reference of the auditor. Okay, so those are for our audit documentation.